Are you ready for rant mode? Then strap in for rant mode. Because here we are today, folks. So let's talk about the Mozart effect. This is a pretty infamous effect that has been talked about a lot, not just in like research studies, but also in like mainstream consciousness as well. And I decided I really wanted to make a video on this subject because like I have feelings about this thing because I've heard all your basic standard factoids and information that you've probably heard if you're at all familiar with the term the Mozart effect. But then I've also, like when I did, for example, my class on piano pedagogy, when I had to kind of go and dive into a lot of studies about music education and how children learn in music, and I had to read a lot of studies on that, I suddenly came across a few things kind of talking about how the Mozart effect wasn't what it was all cracked up to be. So first of all, let's set a baseline. What is the Mozart effect? If you have not heard of this term before. So the Mozart effect comes from this idea that basically listening to Mozart will somehow increase your IQ and make you smarter. That's the whole premise of the idea and this theory. And this whole idea comes from a 1993 study published by Frances Rauscher and her team that looked into the effects of listening to various types of music while performing different spatial reasoning puzzles. And they found that when the group that listened to Mozart's K448 Sonata compared to all the other groups, including the control group, they found that that specific group performed better on the spatial reasoning tests than all the other groups did. These findings were interesting, and so they published their results in the journal Nature. And so word eventually got out about the findings of the study until it started hitting the mainstream news. This specifically started with an article in the New York Times that was written by Alex Ross that was titled Classical View Listening to Prozac Mozart. And in that specific article, Ross mislabeled the results of the study. Whether this was intentional or not, it's hard to say. But the study actually only researched the spatial reasoning tests. But in the New York Times article, Ross wrote that listening to Mozart actually increased IQ points. And this got the public's attention. And all of a sudden, the idea of the Mozart effect, as it was now being dubbed, started just exploding everywhere, and people gravitated to this idea that listening to Mozart could somehow make you smarter. And in fact, Rauscher's team did eventually go back to their original study and try to look into it a little further. A year later, in 1994, they published another study where they had done some research on preschool-aged children to see if exposing them to just music education in general would do anything for their spatial reasoning. See, Rauscher and her team were very specifically focused on the spatial reasoning tests that they had originally studied. So Rauscher and her team followed this group of preschool-aged children and found that when these students were getting regular weekly music lessons, that when they then performed the spatial reasoning tests on these children, the Mozart group did do better by about 4 points on average than all the other groups on the spatial reasoning test. Now, what their study also found, especially on this preschool age group of children, is that when you did other tests that were not spatial reasoning, the difference between the Mozart group and all the other groups was non-existent. They performed about the same, with sometimes the Mozart group even performing a little bit worse. And this entire time, Rauscher and her team never really tried to study anything outside of the spatial reasoning thing. But unfortunately, the public still gravitated towards this idea that listening to Mozart makes you smarter. And if you were a child of the late 90s or early 2000s, you probably remember some kind of this marketing. I mean, there was CDs that were sold everywhere with the push that you need to get your kids to listening to Mozart at a very young age to make them smarter. In fact, there was even a piano book series titled Music for Little Mozarts that was aimed at about preschool age to maybe kindergarten up to first grade age children, teaching them piano at a very early age with the expectation of exposing children to music very early in order to make them smarter, or at least help them in some kind of school-related way. In fact, if you even watch The Incredibles movie from 2004, you see a little remnant of the Mozart effect being portrayed in the little short they had with Jack Jack and the babysitter. The babysitter specifically puts on music for Jack Jack that is Mozart, with the attempt of trying to make Jack Jack smarter and trying to help out his brain. This idea permeated every little inch of any kind of popular culture. This idea of listening to Mozart somehow makes you smarter. And note that I'm not making fun of any of the things that promoted this idea and sold stuff to parents and children with this idea that they need to be pushing music education and Mozart onto these kids. In fact, I actually learned from the Music for Little Mozart's book series, but it is sort of that effect of we had to title it Mozart. I mean, there's a whole bunch of other characters in that book too that are also based on other famous composers, but the whole idea that we had to put Mozart in the title just feels even more like this idea that it's Mozart, 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 that does something about making people smarter. And part of this also comes from the study itself, because the study didn't just compare Mozart music against other music, and one of the songs they also used against the Mozart group was a piece by Philip Glass, another famous classical music composer, however, just a much more modern classical music composer. And the people who listened to that particular piece in that study also didn't perform as well as the Mozart group. So, what does that leave us with? Does the Mozart effect actually work in any kind of way? Well, here's where we start to run into a few problems. Because, of course, with any good study, you want to perform several more versions of the study to see if it actually works, if it was a one-time fluke, or if there is something actually there. And many studies have been done since then, and many meta-analyses have been performed on the studies surrounding this original Mozart study, and the results have been mixed at best. Some of the studies have tried to replicate the original one to a T, trying to have these various students listen to various different types of music, or nothing at all, or white noise, and see how well they did on the spatial reasoning test. And some of them have been able to replicate it, and some of them have not. Some studies have done a variation of the original one. For example, there was one that played music and various other sounds, or no sound for the control group, for rats in utero. It was in utero and then 60 days postpartum. They found that the Mozart group of rats performed better on spatial reasoning and maze puzzles than the other rats in that group. But again, that's rats and not humans, and the human studies have been mixed at best. And all of this is still on spatial reasoning tests, not IQ tests. And on top of this, the results from the original test only were found to last about 15 to 20 minutes. After that period of time, the effect wore off. So there was something about this spatial reasoning test that can sometimes be replicated if you specifically listen to Mozart. However, this is not going to stop people from just going off and saying, oh, the Mozart effect is a real thing. Oh, you should expose your children to music education at a young age. Oh, you should always play Mozart for your children specifically because that is going to somehow make them smarter. The real answer here, no. No, it's not. It's not going to do anything like that. The original study never tried to study anything to that effect. The studies that have come out and tried to replicate that were spotty at best. You know, some of them found the same results, some of them did not and found no difference at all. And the reasonings why this effect might even occur in the first place are still not even super clear. The best ideas I could come up with in my research was that maybe because the part of your brain that processes spatial reasoning and the part that listens to the music and lights up when you listen to Mozart-like music were the same side of the brain, and so because the connections were similar, one kind of helped the other. But it never seemed to be more than a temporary effect. Nothing ever seemed to be long-term. The effects on the preschool children were never studied beyond the 8 months that they were given to the kids. And again, none of this is about IQ. So don't go listening to Mozart expecting it's going to make you smarter. Don't play Mozart for your kids because you think it's going to make them smarter. Play Mozart because you like Mozart. That's the real answer here. Some studies hypothesize that it might just be effect of if you like that music, it might do something for you. Temporarily. In spatial reasoning puzzles. So, you know, I mean, if somebody's got a gun to your head and they say, do a spatial reasoning puzzle, then maybe turn on Mozart's K448. Well, with the end of that little frustrating rant, I hope you enjoyed this little video today. And this week, go listen to classical music only if you want to, not out of some weird obligation that it's somehow magically going to give you IQ points. And of course, if you like this video and you would like to see more of it, feel free to subscribe. I post videos almost weekly about music and music education and music history. And otherwise, I will see you next time. Goodbye! Written by Alex Ross. I would have gotten that right. Article in the New York Times published. This specifically started with an article in the New York Times. Oh my gosh. Okay. Where is it at? There it is. Okay. You know what? Whatever. Lessons of some kind were... Now, what their study did also find. The stupid gnats. Get over here. I'm gonna crush you. Oh.